The year was 1888, a time when the world was stitched together with iron rails and powered by steam and sweat. At the Grand Union Depot in Ogden, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, hot metal, and the anxious energy of 100 different journeys beginning or ending. Amidst the cacophony of hissing engines, rumbling baggage carts, and the echoing calls of conductors, an 8-year-old girl sat perfectly still on a hard wooden bench. Her name was Hannah, though no one there knew it. She had been placed on that bench 2 hours ago by her stepmother, Martha, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched by a discontentment that had only sharpened since Hannah's father had succumbed to a fever that winter. Martha had pressed a single worn coin into Hannah's palm. "You wait right here," she had commanded, her voice thin and sharp as a needle. "I have to see a man about our ticket. Don't you move a muscle." Then she had straightened her bonnet, smoothed her severe grey dress, and disappeared into the throng of travelers, melting away like a snowflake on a hot stove. Hannah waited. She was good at waiting. Her whole life since her father's passing had been an exercise in waiting for a kind word that never came, waiting for a meal she was not sure she would get, waiting for the heavy silence in their small rented rooms to break. She clutched the coin in one hand, and in the pocket of her faded calico dress, her fingers curled around her only true possession, a small, smooth wooden bird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. Her father had carved it for her in the evenings, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he coaxed the shape from a block of pine. It was all she had left of him. The station clock ticked on. The sun, once a bright slash on the dusty floor, retreated, and the gas lamps hissed to life, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cavernous station feel even larger and more intimidating. The crowd thinned. A train shrieked its final departure, its rhythmic chuffing fading into the distance until only the quiet hum of the building remained. Hannah was still there, a small solitary island in a sea of empty benches. She had not moved a muscle. But she knew with the cold, heavy certainty that only a child who has learned disappointment early can possess that Martha was not coming back. The coin in her hand was not for a ticket, it was the price of her abandonment. Arthur Vance did not like towns. He tolerated them as a necessity, a place to procure supplies and conduct the business that kept his sprawling ranch, the Vance Expanse, profitable. The noise, the people, the suffocating closeness of it all chafed at the quiet, orderly solitude he had cultivated for himself over the last decade. His life was measured by the seasons, the needs of his cattle, and the vast, unpitying sky over his land. It was a life built on a foundation of loss, a fortress of hard work designed to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. He had come to the depot to collect a new piece of harnessing equipment arriving on the evening train from the east. It was late, and his patience, always a finite resource, was worn thin. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of labor, with a face that looked as if it were carved from the same rugged landscape he called home. His eyes, a pale, clear grey, missed nothing but revealed little. The townsfolk of Ogden saw him as a successor-rich rancher, a man of substance. But they also saw him as cold, remote, a man walled off from the world. They were not wrong. He was turning to leave, his business concluded, when he saw her, a little slip of a thing, perched at the end of a long bench, looking impossibly small beneath the station's vaulted ceiling. Her feet, in their scuffed boots, did not quite touch the floor. He noted her worn dress, the tightness of her shoulders, the way she stared straight ahead into the gloom. He frowned. A child left behind. It was a loose thread, a messy complication in a world he strove to keep neat. It was not his concern. He had his own life, his own silence to return to. He took 2 steps towards the exit, the sound of his boots echoing in the near-empty hall. But he stopped. He had built his life around an absence, a gaping hole left by his wife, Eleanor, and the son they had lost with her. The silence of his grand ranch house was not peaceful. It was the sound of what wasn't there, and in the profound stillness of this child, he recognized a similar quiet. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of loss. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he turned back. Arthur approached the bench slowly, his footsteps announcing his presence. He was not a man accustomed to delicacy, especially with children, who were to him a foreign species. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. "You're out late," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound more suited to commanding ranch hands than speaking to a little girl. Hannah flinched, but did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "I'm waiting," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Waiting for who?" he pressed, his tone more practical than kind. "My stepmother. She told me to wait here." Arthur glanced around the empty station. The last train had long since gone. The station master was preparing to lock up for the night. "Seems to me she's forgotten you," he stated, the words blunt, without comfort. At this, Hannah finally turned her head. Her eyes were large and startlingly direct in her small, pale face. They were the color of moss after a rain, and they held a gravity that belied her years. There were no tears, only a stark, unnerving acceptance. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply looked at him, and in that look, he saw the confirmation of his suspicion. The woman was not coming back. A feeling of profound irritation washed over him. He was a rancher, not a guardian for stray children. He grunted and strode over to the station master, a harried man named Peters, who was eager to get home. "There's a child here," Arthur said, jerking a thumb towards the bench. "Been left." Peters sighed, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. "Saw her myself. Thought her people were in the privy. Happens all the time." He looked over at Hannah, then back at Arthur, his expression weary. "Well, I'll have to take her down to Sheriff Callahan. Not that he'll know what to do with her till morning." A cold wind rattled the station doors, carrying with it the first splatters of rain. A storm was rolling in off the mountains, a big one by the look of the bruised purple clouds. Arthur thought of the long, dark ride back to his ranch. Then he thought of this child being shuffled into a cold, unwelcoming cell for the night. The image sat poorly with him, an unwelcome burr under the saddle of his conscience. "The sheriff's office is no place for a child," Arthur found himself saying, the words surprising him as much as they did Peter's. The station master shrugged, a gesture of helplessness. "Got no orphanage here, Mr. Vance. And no one's looking to take in a stranger's kid, especially on a night like this." He paused, a calculating look entering his eyes as he sized up the wealthy rancher. "Your place is big, and you've got that housekeeper, just for the night, till the sheriff can sort it out in the morning." Arthur's immediate instinct was to refuse. His house was a sanctuary of solitude, a monument to his grief. The thought of introducing a child into that hallowed silence felt like a violation. But then he looked back at Hannah, still sitting on that bench, a picture of absolute desolation. He remembered another small form, impossibly still, wrapped in a blanket all those years ago. The memory was a physical blow, stealing his breath. Against every instinct, against all logic, he heard himself agree. "Fine," he bit out, "for the night. Have the sheriff come out to my place tomorrow. First thing." He walked back to the bench, his jaw tight. "Come on," he said to Hannah, the word more of a command than an invitation. Hannah looked up at the towering, grim-faced man. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. But she had no other choice. Her stepmother was gone. This man was her only escape from the echoing emptiness of the station. She slid off the bench, her small hand protectively in her pocket, her fingers wrapped tight around the wooden bird. Without a word, she followed him out into the rain-swept night. The ride to the Vance expanse was long and silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves, the rumble of the wagon wheels over the rutted track, and the rising howl of the wind. Hannah sat huddled under a thick wool blanket Arthur had thrown over her, the rough fabric smelling of horse and leather, and the clean scent of the coming storm. She stole glances at the man beside her. His profile was stark against the fading light, his hands firm and capable on the reins as he navigated the familiar road. He never looked at her, his gaze fixed on the path ahead as if she were just another piece of cargo, a sack of flour or a roll of wire. They finally arrived at the ranch house. It was bigger than any building Hannah had ever seen up close, a two-story structure of dark timber and stone, with a wide porch and windows that glowed with a lonely, golden light. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, solid and imposing against the wild, darkening landscape. A woman with grey hair pulled into a severe bun and a surprisingly kind face opened the door before they even reached it. This was Mrs. Gable, Arthur's housekeeper, a woman whose presence was as much a fixture of the ranch as the ancient cottonwoods that lined the creek. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Hannah, but she betrayed no other surprise. Mrs. Gable was a woman who had learned long ago that her employer was a man of few words and sudden, inexplicable actions. "Get her inside," Arthur grunted, lifting Hannah down from the wagon as if she weighed nothing. "She needs to be fed and put to bed." He spoke of her as if she were a lost calf he had found on the range. Mrs. Gable simply nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at Hannah's pale, rain-streaked face. "Of course, Mr. Vance." She took Hannah's small, cold hand. Her own was warm and dry. "Come along, dear. Let's get you out of this wet dress and find you some supper." Hannah allowed herself to be led into the house. The inside was like the outside, vast, dark, and overwhelmingly male. Polished wood floors, heavy leather furniture, and the heads of deer and elk mounted on the walls. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, but the fire within it was low, casting more shadows than warmth. The air was still and smelled of wood smoke and old books. It was the quietest house she had ever been in. It was a house that had forgotten the sound of laughter. Mrs. Gable provided her with a simple supper of bread and milk in the warm kitchen, the only room in the house that felt truly lived in. Arthur ate his own meal in silence at the head of a long, empty dining table. Afterwards, Mrs. Gable led Hannah upstairs to a room at the end of the hall. The room was clean and spare, containing a simple bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out into the stormy darkness. In one corner, draped in a white dust cloth, stood a shape Hannah recognized with a pang of sorrow, a wooden crib. Arthur, who had followed them to the doorway, stopped abruptly when he saw it. A flicker of something pain, raw and unguarded, crossed his face before he masked it again with his habitual austerity. He had not been in this room in 10 years. He turned away without a word and retreated down the hall, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. "You sleep now," Mrs. Gable said gently, tucking a thick quilt around Hannah's small frame. "You're safe here tonight." Hannah lay in the strange bed, listening to the storm rage outside. The house groaned and settled around her, unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar place. She was not with her cruel stepmother, but she was not home either. She did not know what home was anymore. She pulled the little wooden bird from her pocket and held it tight in her hand under the covers. Its smooth, familiar shape was a small anchor in a vast, uncertain sea. She closed her eyes and, despite her fear, exhaustion claimed her. Later that night, a sound pierced the heavy silence of the house. A child's cry, thin and terrified. Arthur sat bolt upright in his bed. The sound was so alien in his quiet world that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. Then it came again, a choked sob from the end of the hall. It was the girl, Hannah. He rose, pulling on his trousers, and moved down the hallway, guided by the muffled sounds. He pushed open her door. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he could see her thrashing in the big bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. "No," she whimpered. "Please." He did not know what to do. His instincts for comfort had withered and died with Eleanor. He stood there, a large, useless silhouette in the doorway. He should wake her, but he was reluctant to touch her. Instead, he simply walked over to the chair by the window and sat down. He did not speak. He just sat, his presence a silent, solid weight in the room. Gradually, as if sensing she was no longer alone, Hannah's frantic movements subsided. Her breathing evened out, deepening into the steady rhythm of sleep. She had curled onto her side, her small fist resting on the pillow. From her grasp, the wing of the little wooden bird peeked out. Arthur remained in the chair for a long time, watching her sleep. The storm outside began to pass, the rain softening to a gentle patter. In the quiet aftermath, the defenses he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to feel brittle, inadequate. He had filled his life with work, with land, with cattle, solid, predictable things that could not die in childbirth, that could not be stolen from him by fate. But this child, this unwanted, cast-off piece of humanity, had breached his walls without even trying. He felt a stir of something he had not felt in a decade, a fierce, unwelcome, and undeniable protectiveness. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The sun shone brightly on a landscape glistening with rainwater. Hannah awoke feeling small and lost in the big bed. She dressed quickly in her worn clothes and crept downstairs, drawn by the smell of bacon and coffee. She found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, humming softly as she worked at the stove. "Good morning," the housekeeper said, offering a small, genuine smile. "Did you sleep well after the storm?" Hannah just nodded, clutching her wooden bird in her pocket. She felt a desperate need to be useful, to earn her keep, to not be a burden that would be cast aside again. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Gable seemed taken aback, then her smile widened. "Well, I suppose you could set the cutlery on the table for us. Just 2 places in here." Arthur found them like that when he came in from his morning chores. Mrs. Gable at the stove and Hannah carefully, painstakingly, placing a fork and knife beside 2 plates at the small kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway, observing the small domestic scene. For the first time, he was not eating alone in the cavernous dining room. He saw the way Hannah's brow was furrowed in concentration, the focused intent on her simple task. She was not asking for anything, only trying to contribute. Over the next few days, a strange rhythm established itself. Sheriff Callahan did come, as promised. He reported that he had sent a wire to the next town on the line and located Martha. The stepmother had claimed Hannah was a difficult child who had run off. She said she would come to collect her as soon as she could arrange passage. The sheriff had left with a promise to return when Martha arrived. The news settled like a stone in Arthur's gut. He found reasons to delay. The roads were washed out from the storm, he told the sheriff. It would be a few days before they were passable. It was a lie, but a plausible one. And in that stolen time he watched Hannah. He watched her follow Mrs. Gable in the garden, her small hands struggling to pull weeds. He watched her sit on the porch for hours, her gaze fixed on the horses in the corral. He saw the way she cared for the wooden bird, sometimes talking to it in soft whispers when she thought no one was listening. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable found him staring out the kitchen window at Hannah, who was trying to mimic the ranch hands, mending a piece of fence, her small face serious. "That bird," Mrs. Gable said quietly. "Her father carved it for her. He died this past winter. The stepmother, she wasn't kind." Arthur did not reply, but his jaw tightened. He understood cruelty. He had seen it in nature, in the unforgiving cycles of life and death on the prairie. But the deliberate cruelty of one person to a helpless child was a different kind of evil. It was a poison. And the thought of sending Hannah back to that poison was becoming more and more unthinkable. The silence in his house was changing. It was no longer the oppressive silence of emptiness. It was a quiet that was now occupied by a small, resilient presence. He found himself listening for the soft pad of her feet on the stairs, found himself looking for her small figure on the porch when he rode in from the fields. He had lived in a grey, colourless world for so long, and this child, with her quiet grief and solemn watchfulness, was slowly, imperceptibly, bringing colour back into it. He was beginning to see her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be protected. A week after Hannah's arrival, a dusty buggy rattled up the long drive to the ranch house. Arthur saw it coming from the barn. In the driver's seat was Sheriff Callahan, and beside him sat a woman in a severe grey dress, her face a mask of grim righteousness. It was Martha. Hannah was on the porch, trying to coax a stray kitten with a saucer of milk. When she saw the buggy, she froze. All the color drained from her face. The saucer slipped from her fingers and shattered on the wooden planks. In an instant, she was on her feet and running, not away, but towards the barn, towards the one person she had instinctively come to see as a shield. She crashed into Arthur's legs, her small hands gripping the rough fabric of his trousers. She was trembling, but she made no sound. She just hid behind him, her face pressed against his leg. Arthur placed a large, heavy hand on her head. It was the first time he had willingly touched her. The gesture was unplanned, instinctual. He stood his ground as the sheriff and Martha climbed down from the buggy. "Arthur," the sheriff began, his expression uncomfortable. "Mistress Thorne is here to collect her stepdaughter." Martha stepped forward, her lips a thin, hard line. She tried to project an air of maternal concern, but her eyes were cold and assessing as they swept over the grand house and the vast lands beyond. "Hannah, you naughty girl," she said, her voice cloyingly sweet. "Running off and worrying me so. You've caused this good man a world of trouble." Arthur felt the child behind him flinch. He kept his hand firmly on her head, a silent anchor. He looked directly at Martha, his pale grey eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "She didn't run off," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. "She was left at a train station with a single coin." Martha's facade flickered. "That's a lie. The girl is a storyteller, always has been." "Is she?" Arthur's voice was deceptively calm. He knew this woman's kind. She was not here for the child. She was here because she had heard that the child had landed in a place of wealth. She was smelling opportunity. "You know, Mistress Thorne, raising a child is a great expense, a burden, some might say, especially for a woman on her own." A flicker of avarice, quick and ugly, appeared in Martha's eyes before she could hide it. "It is my duty. Her father would have wanted it." "I'm sure," Arthur said, his tone laced with ice, "but I'm a man who believes in easing burdens." He reached into his coat pocket. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a leather pouch and a folded legal document. He had ridden to a neighboring town 2 days prior to have a lawyer draw it up. "I am prepared to offer you a sum to compensate you for your past troubles and to relieve you of your future duties. A clean break." The sheriff shifted his weight, his eyes wide. He was witnessing a transaction he had not anticipated. Martha stared at the pouch, then at the document. Her greed warred with her pretense of righteousness. "This is highly irregular," she stammered, though her eyes remained fixed on the money pouch. "These are irregular circumstances," Arthur countered smoothly. He tossed the pouch onto a nearby hay bale. It landed with a heavy, satisfying clink of coin. "That is $500. Enough for a new start, far from here. All you have to do is sign this document, witnessed by the sheriff, relinquishing all claim to the child." Martha's resolve crumbled. $500 was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen. The child was a worthless mouth to feed. The money was a future. She snatched the paper from Arthur's hand and scanned it, her lips moving as she read. She looked at the implacable rancher, at the nervous sheriff, and at the pouch of money. The choice was already made. "Give me the pen," she said, her voice raw. Sheriff Callahan, looking relieved to have the matter resolved, produced a pen. Martha scrawled her name at the bottom of the page with a vicious jab. She grabbed the money pouch without another glance at the child hiding behind Arthur's legs, climbed back into the buggy, and urged the horse into a trot, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. She did not look back. The sheriff cleared his throat, took the signed document from Arthur, and folded it carefully. "Well," he said, avoiding Arthur's eyes, "seems this is settled. I'll file this at the courthouse. She's your ward now, I suppose." "Legally." He tipped his hat, climbed into his own saddle and rode off, leaving the two of them alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The dust settled. The immediate threat was gone. Arthur looked down. Hannah was still pressed against his leg, her small body rigid. He knelt, an awkward, unaccustomed movement for him, bringing himself down to her level. For the first time, he looked her fully in the face, not as a problem or a burden, but as his charge. As his. "She's gone," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She won't be back." Hannah looked up at him, her moss-green eyes wide and searching. She saw the hard lines of his face, the deep-set grief that still shadowed his eyes, but she also saw something new taking root there. A resolve, a purpose, a promise. "You're home, Hannah," he said, the words feeling both strange and profoundly right on his tongue. He rested his hand on her shoulder, the gesture now feeling natural, necessary. "This is your home now." For the first time since her father had died, Hannah felt the tight, cold knot of fear inside her begin to dissolve. A single hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she leaned forward and, with a tentative shyness, wrapped her small arms around his neck. Arthur froze for a moment, his body stiff with surprise. Then his own arms came up and enclosed her in a protective, grounding embrace. On the vast, lonely expanse of his ranch, under the wide and watchful sky, a family was born not of blood, but of circumstance, of resilience, and of the unexpected grace of a broken man finding a reason to heal. The seasons turned on the vast expanse. Summer bled into a golden autumn, and autumn gave way to the crisp, clean silence of winter. The ranch house, once a hollow monument to sorrow, began to fill with new sounds. The soft thud of small boots on the stairs, the murmur of a child's voice reading aloud by the fire, and on rare, startling occasions, the sound of laughter. Arthur found his world reordered around this small, quiet girl. He bought her new clothes, dresses of soft flannel and sturdy denim. He cleared the dust and the ghosts from the nursery, and with Mrs. Gable's help, transformed it into Hannah's room, with a proper bed, a small desk, and a shelf for the books he found himself buying for her in town. The old, unused crib was dismantled and stored away in the barn, a final closing of a painful chapter. He taught her to ride, starting her on a gentle, aging mare named Daisy. He watched with a strange feeling of pride as her initial fear gave way to a quiet confidence in the saddle. They would ride out together, checking fence lines or moving cattle to new pastures. During these long, quiet rides, she would ask him questions about the names of the wildflowers, why the sky was blue, how a cow knew which calf was hers. He answered her with a patience he never knew he possessed, the words coming more easily with each passing day. In the evenings, after supper, a new ritual formed. They would sit by the fire in the great room, and he would read to her from his late wife's collection of books. He would read tales of adventure and far-off lands, his deep voice filling the room that had been silent for so long. Hannah would listen, her head often resting against his arm, her wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece, as if it, too, were listening. One evening, as he was reading, she reached out and traced the scar on the back of his hand, a pale line from a long-ago encounter with barbed wire. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. Arthur looked down at his hand, then at her earnest face, illuminated by the firelight. "No," he said, after a moment's thought. "Not anymore. Scars just remind you that you healed." He realized in that moment the profound truth of his own words. He was healing. The raw, open wound of his grief, which he had guarded for a decade, was finally beginning to scar over. This child, with her quiet strength and her unspoken understanding of loss, had been the balm he never knew he needed. She had not replaced what he had lost, but she had given him something new to live for, a reason to look forward instead of back. One crisp spring morning, nearly a year after she had arrived, Arthur and Hannah stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. His ranch, his land, no longer looked empty to him. It looked full. It looked like a future. Hannah, now a healthy, bright-eyed 9-year-old, stood beside him, her hand tucked comfortably into his. She was no longer the frightened, abandoned girl from the train station. She was home. "Arthur," she said, her voice clear in the morning air. "Yes, Hannah. My father used to say that a home isn't the building you live in," she said, looking up at him. "It's the people you live with." Arthur looked down at her, at the trust and affection shining in her eyes. A slow smile spread across his face, easing the hard lines and reaching all the way to his own eyes, making them shine with a light that had been absent for a decade. He squeezed her hand gently. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer fought, "was a very wise man." Together, they watched the new day dawn over their shared world, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones you don't expect, pieced together from broken parts to create a whole stronger and more resilient than ever before. The rich rancher had discovered a wealth beyond land or money, and the orphan girl had found that the end of one journey can be the beginning of a far greater one.